All right, let's look at exercise 612 here, dealing with the CVP format for the income statement. So this is a little bit different than your gross profit income statement that you would see traditionally for external filing purposes. So Malinowski Corp produces luxury headphones. During 2018, Malinowski produces and sells 15,000 units at a selling price of $250 per unit. Costs incurred to generate sales included variable cost of goods sold per unit of $100, variable selling and administrative costs per unit of $15, fixed costs of goods sold of $1.4 million, and fixed selling and administrative costs of $375,000. Based off of this information, they want us to prepare the CVP income statement for the year ended December 31st. They want us to calculate the break-even point in units and in sales dollars, and then doing some analysis here, like really what the value add for this information is being able to make decisions, seeing how can we adjust break-even point downward based off of the information given. So I have taken the information from the question stem, reproduced it here. So units produced and sold were 15,000. Selling price per unit of $250 per unit. Variable cost of goods sold was $100 per unit. Variable selling and admin was $15 per unit. Total fixed cost of goods sold was 1.4 million, and total fixed selling and admin was 375,000. Remember the general format for a CVP income statement. It's sales less your variable costs equals your contribution margin, less your fixed costs equals your operating income. And that's the formula or the format that we followed here. So a few things to note. One, the heading, you have the name of the company, you have the name of the statement. In this case, you could just write income statement. You don't have to put CVP income statement, but I just want it there so you're aware of the format of the income statement. And for the time period, in this case, it's for the year ended December 31st. So the results showing here are for the entire year. In this case, it'd be a calendar year since the end is December 31st. Notice too, we have two different columns. We have a total column and we have a per unit column, but the per unit column doesn't go all the way down. It ends at contribution margin. Because remember, we talked about earlier in this chapter, fixed cost per unit doesn't really give us useful information, so we don't report it. So we don't necessarily need to show that on the income statement. So we start with sales. Total sales was we sold 15,000 units at $250 a piece. So if you multiply the two, you get $3.75 million in sales. On a total basis per unit, it's just the sales price of $250. Then we subtract out our variable costs. So that's both variable cost of goods sold and variable selling and administrative costs. So how did we calculate that? We take our units sold of 15,000 and we multiply it by the total variable cost per unit, which was cost of goods sold of 100, selling and admin of 15, so $115 per unit times the 15,000 units sold gets us total variable costs of 1.725 million per unit. That's just simply adding up the variable cost of goods sold of $100 per unit and the variable selling and admin of 15. That's how we get variable cost per unit of $115. We subtract these two to get to our contribution margin. So contribution margin, remember, it's sales less variable costs. So total contribution margin was $2,025,000. Contribution margin per unit, we calculate it the same way. It's selling price less variable cost per unit. So we get contribution margin per unit of $135. And again, that's where this column ends. Next, we add up our fixed costs. So we have two sources of fixed costs. We have our fixed cost of goods sold, which is 1.4 million, and our selling and admin fixed cost of 375,000. So if you add them up, you get 1,775,000. To get to our bottom line, we simply subtract contribution margin minus fixed costs, gets us operating income of $250,000. So this would be our income statement. Based off of this, now we can go ahead and do some CVP analysis, figure out what is break-even point and so on. Our break-even point in units, remember our formula, it's fixed cost divided by contribution margin per unit. Fixed costs were 1.775 million. Our contribution margin per unit, which we get from the income statement as well, was $135. So rounding to the nearest unit, we get a break-even point in units of 13,148. So if we sell that many units, our operating income would be zero. How does that translate to break-even point in sales? In this case, we can take our break-even point in units, which was approximately 13,148, and we multiply it by the selling price per unit, which was $250, which again, we have up here. So in order to break even, we would have to sell or generate revenue of about 3.2, almost $3.3 million in revenue. Now the real value add again is we can analyze this to see what are some of our options. How can we drive down this break-even point? We have a few options based off of, knowing how it's calculated, how it's incurred. We can increase selling price, but obviously that's a lot harder, especially if we are in a very competitive market. It might be hard for us to increase prices without increasing functionality or perception of increase in value being perceived by the customer, but that is an option. We can find a way to lower the cost of materials and lower our variable cost per unit. We have much more control over variable costs than we do fixed costs. So we can see, can we lower variable cost per unit, variable COGS per unit? We can also see, can we try and unload some of the fixed costs, the overhead that we have? If we're able to do so, obviously that would drive this number down. So in our formula, our numerator would go down. So then this number would go down, or a combination of all three. This is not an exhaustive list. There could be other options here, but generally speaking, these are the ways, these are the options that are at our disposal if we are trying to lower that break-even point.